Okay, so I've dispensed with the idea that I should start by defining complex system. I'm not going to do that other than the definition I've just given you. But what I've done means that I now really need to define what mathematical modelling is. And of course, if you've got this far in your education, you've studied mathematical modelling to a great degree. But I think it's useful just to go over again what we do when we do mathematical modelling and why we do it. So what is mathematical modelling? Well, mathematical modelling, I think, is just a way of travelling from A to B. So A is our assumptions about the world, and B is the consequences of these assumptions. And mathematics is a rigorous way of thinking which takes us from our assumptions to our consequences. We want to try and find out, we want to assume something about the world, and we want to derive the consequences of this. This is a definition I got from reading Richard Feynman's book. Mathematics is really that. It's a toolbox for trying to find out what are the consequences of certain assumptions. So why do we do mathematical modelling? Well, there's actually lots of different answers to that. And I think that they broadly fall into 4 different categories. The first one of these is to explain data as simply as possible. If we have some data about the world, we want a simple model which tries to explain the relationships inside these data. The second one is to link together different levels of explanation. Here we can talk about integration. We want to integrate up from one level to the other. A third is to provide very detailed descriptions of what goes on within a system and how it works. And a fourth, which is very important too, is predicting the future. If we have a mathematical model of something and we have a really good understanding of a system, we should be able to predict what will happen in the future. If we've built a bridge with a good mathematical understanding of how the construction works, then we can predict that it's not going to fall over for some amount of time. So those are my 4 reasons that you might want to build a mathematical model. I think it's good if I just explain in a little bit more detail what I mean by each of these cases. So explaining data simply. What I've written here is we want to provide 1 or 2 simple rules from which everything else is derived. This is really a qualitative modelling. In many systems, we're going to be describing qualitative properties of the system. But it necessarily means we want to compare something to data. We want a qualitative description which compares something for data. Now what I like is this idea of the explanation ratio. This is something I got from reading Richard Dawkins. The explanation ratio, the idea is that you want to explain a certain thing and you want to divide it by the assumptions. So if the assumptions are very shortly stated and the amount of different things that are explained is very big, then we can be happy. And Richard Dawkins uses the example of natural selection. So Charles Darwin describes the theory of natural selection, and it explains a lot of what we see in the biological world. So the explanation ratio is extremely high. Lots of things explained by a simple description of the idea of survival of the fittest. Now, we see these types of simple explanations everywhere in physics and also in other areas in biology. But one nice example in physics, which you learn as a first-year physics undergraduate or even before you start your studies in physics, is Newton's second law. So this man pushing the car is experiencing Newton's second law, and we can write down those equations and they describe the motion of almost all bodies that we can move on Earth in any case. Not just this man pushing the car, but also me picking up a pen or me moving around here. Newton's second law explains the dynamics of lots of different systems with one simple equation. Another example is the diffusion equation. I've written heat equation here, and it describes the movement and the spread of particles. So if we can solve this equation, which relates the time derivative to the second derivative of spatial movement, we can describe how particles move out in a gas. We can also describe how animals move out round a territory, We can even describe to some degree our own movements, our own physical movements around. We can use this diffusion equation to describe our random movements in some sense, and it applies to a whole range of different systems. In biology, a classic example is the predator-prey model, equations I give here, and it could be foxes and hares, or it could be sharks and fish, but the idea is that you have a simple model which describes the interactions of two different species, and these equations can capture those interactions for a lot of different types of systems. So we see it throughout physics, chemistry and biology that a small set of equations can capture a wide variety of different phenomena. I was going to go into one example, one of my favourite examples where this applies, just to show you here what I want to do is I want to get out the idea that the same equation can be used again and again in different settings. And that's what you see if you read through scientific literature. You see that people are using the same equation to describe various very, very different phenomena. So one of my favourite examples of using a single equation to describe lots of different systems is the logistic equation, logistic growth. What I show here is the logistic growth equation, dx by dt, the rate of change of x, as a function of x itself. And so you can think of, in this case, I've given it with reference to the spread of a disease. X is the number of people infected with a disease in the population, and all of these people go around coming into contact with other people, and they do so at rate p. Each individual comes in contact with other people at rate p, and then as a whole, px is then the rate of contact that these people generate. So the more people are infected with this disease, the faster the disease spreads. But of course, if lots of people are infected with the disease, then they normally contact people who already have the disease. And so this is where the 1 minus x over n comes in. It's the probability that a contact is with an uninfected individual. And so the equation at the top gives us the overall rate of spread of the disease, px 1 minus x over n. And this equation, I've described it in terms of disease, but this equation can be used whenever we're trying to model or understand the spread of something. That's an example where we do apply it to disease spread. We can also use it to describe things like growths of population. Here I've taken an example of yeast growths. X is the number of yeast, px is their rate of dividing, and 1 minus x over n is the proportion of the environment which is unoccupied. And so once the whole entire environment is occupied with yeast, then it doesn't spread and it doesn't grow anymore. And you see this in a whole range of growth of animals and plants and bacteria, that they follow this logistic growth curve. They first go up and they stabilize like that. This is an example from ant foraging. This is ants leave pheromone when they recruit to a food source, and you see this same thing, this logistic growth, that first the ants come back, they recruit other ants, then there's a fast growth, then all the ants are recruited and it levels off again. My final example here is in diffusion of innovations. They've explained, for example, how seeds are adopted by farmers across a country, how drugs are adopted by doctors and so on, and you often find exactly this same type of logistic growth. So x is the number adopting a technology, px is the rate of informing about that technology, and then 1 minus xn, well, once those people have already adopted the technology, then it can't spread anymore. So the important point to take away from all of this is the same equation, this same simple explanation can be used in a lot of different situations. My second suggested way that we might want to use mathematical models is in linking levels of explanation. And this we're going to be doing a lot of on this course. So what I've written here is that large aggregates cannot be understood by simple extrapolation from the behaviour of a few particles. So think back to all the pictures of the nice pretty complex systems I showed in the first video, and then think about if we can really extrapolate just from the individual interactions up to the whole pattern. So if you think about the human development, We can't, of course, there's loads of cells interacting in certain ways to produce the development of a human embryo, but there's no way that we can just have a simple extrapolation. And that's why we need mathematical models. One of the things we say in mathematics is we like to integrate things, and mathematical models allow us to integrate all of the understanding we have about the component parts of a system up from one level to the next. Now, of course, if we're going to do all this integrating different cells and looking at this more complicated type of behavior, then our explanation ratio, this thing that Richard Dawkins likes so much, our explanation ratio may be lower, but we are going to actually produce some sort of more accurate description of the world. There was a tendency, I think, in the 1960s and 1970s to feel that all the problems of physics and the world had been solved. When they found out this standard model for particle interactions, it was felt that once we understand these simple parts, now we just need to extrapolate up to the different levels. And there was an article written by Philip Anderson in the 1970s, in 1972, where he states very clearly why, or argues about why this isn't the case. So what he states is, let's think about the elementary entities of science X that obey the laws of science Y. So going all the way down to the smallest things, we have elementary particle physics, and then we step up to solid state or many body physics. Then many body physics can be used to understand chemistry. Chemistry moves up to molecular biology up to cell biology up to developmental biology, and then we end up with physiology moving up to psychology moving up to the social sciences. So each of these steps, what he writes is that, but the hierarchy does not imply that science X is just applied science Y. At each stage, we need entirely new laws, concepts and generalizations, and they require inspiration and creativity just as great a degree as in the previous one. Psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. And so what he's saying here is that just because you've understood something at one scientific level, it's going to require lots of additional understanding to move that up and to bring that up to the next level. And that's exactly where mathematical modelling comes in. Now, if mathematical models are going to be good for understanding complex systems, we have to be convinced that they do produce some form of complex patterns. One way which scientists have tried to link between levels is using cellular automata models, and I'm going to come to them in a couple of lectures' time, but just now I'm going to give the picture of the output of a cellular automata model. The cellular automata model employs a simple rule to go from one line to the next. We apply the rule, we go down from one line down to the next line, and we make this pattern. But the point is, through a simple rule, we can produce this complex, sort of self-similar pattern. And these seashell patterns can be generated by a cellular automata type model. There's two examples. On the left we have one shell and its pattern generated by the one cellular automata rule, and on the right is another shell with a different cellular automata rule which generates a similar pattern. Now, one example I gave you was pictures of bird flocks, and one thing we'll be doing later in the course is we'll be looking at models of bird flocks and interactions within bird flocks. And just here is a video of a model of these types of interactions. This is just a very simple model where the particles are attracted to each other and they have a blind angle of how they interact. And it produces these complex shapes, these complex moving shapes that have some of the properties of a bird flock. One of the things we'll be concentrating on in this course are models where we have simple rules to describe how particles or parts of a system interact and how they produce more complicated patterns. Okay, the third reason we might want to do mathematical modelling is we want to have a really detailed understanding of a system. What I'm thinking about here is a case where we want to put everything we know down in one place. And this is really a quantitative style of modelling. We want to capture very precisely the dynamics of the system. And we want to really test that this knowledge is self-consistent. We think we know a lot about a system, and we want to build a quantitative model which allows us to simulate and see if we really understand everything about the system. It's to find out exactly how that system works. One example I like to give here is gene regulatory networks. So now developmental biologists are understanding more and more about how genes regulate each other in developmental processes. And this is the detailed model that some researchers have produced for one of these regulatory networks. Now, what they do is they do experiments to test how certain interactions work, and over time they build more and more detailed model expressed in terms of differential equations, which explains how these types of systems work and interact with each other. Experiments come in, they try and integrate all of that new information into this developmental network. This is from maybe 6 years ago, this developmental network, and I'm sure they've gathered in more simulation data, more experimental data, and got more information about how this network looks since then. The last point I mentioned, and I'm just going to say something briefly about this, is predicting the future. One area where you hear a lot about predicting the future using mathematical models is in climate modelling. What's plotted here is the figure from the journal Nature, where they made the prediction about the certain percentage chances of a 4-degree or a 3-degree warming of the world by 2020 or 2040 or so on. And what they did is they built up a big grid-based simulation model of the climate and ran it forward lots of different times to find out with a good confidence interval what the climate will look like if we continue to emit CO2 and other greenhouse gases at the same rate. And this is an important part of public policy making, using models to understand what's going to happen in the future or to predict what's going to happen into the future. So let's go back to my overall diagram here of why we use mathematical models. What I've gone through is a decreasing level of abstraction but an increasing level of description. So when I started talking about natural selection or Newton's equations, I was really trying to explain a whole load of different data as simply as possible. The examples I gave with the celerotometer and the flocking models is they were aimed more to link together different levels of explanation, and they became a little bit less abstract, more details in the rules of interaction and this increasing level of description. By the time I got to my gene regulatory networks, I was providing quite detailed descriptions of how things work. And then finally, when I looked at the climate models, I had a very, very detailed model of how to predict the future of the climate. The other thing I can say, and this is related to the level of prediction, is that the first two examples are really qualitative comparisons between systems. Maybe Newton's law is a bit of an exception, we have a very nice, accurate quantitative comparison, but things like natural selection, things like models of flocking, celerotometer, they have a sort of qualitative nature. We want to understand the qualitative nature of a system and capture it in some form of mathematical model. Well, the last two, the regulatory networks and the climate models, they were very quantitative. If we want to be sure we understand something, we should have a very good quantitative comparison between the system and itself. Now there's a whole kind of blurry line between these different things, but overall we can think of these 1 and 2 types models as trying to make a qualitative, to get a better understanding of a system rather than to make quantitative predictions. Now I have also written this, that 1 and 2 tend to be more fun. We tend to be able to use like nice, neat mathematical models. We can write little simulations which show sort of things. And 3 and 4 tend to be hard work. And what's good, I suppose, about this fun and hard work division is that what we're going to be doing is mostly models of type 1 and in particular of type 2. A lot of this course is going to be about linking together levels of explanation using models. So we're going to use fun models. After you finish your degree, then you can go off and do all the hard work, and probably what people in industry are interested in is the detailed descriptions of how things work and predicting the future. So you can go off and do that after you finish this. But in this course, we're going to concentrate on the fun models which allow us to understand complex systems in a qualitative way.